Hello everyone, and welcome back. Today, I'll be discussing the story of Alexandre Villaplane, the football star who captained the French national team at the first ever World Cup and was later executed for crimes against humanity. A sensational football talent, Villaplane was also among the most brutal Nazi collaborators active in occupied France during the Second World War. I'm the Lunar Librarian, and this is the story of how an Olympic athlete became an SS commander who terrorized the French population on the orders of the Nazi government for years before his capture and execution by French resistance fighters. This is the case of Alexandre Villaplane. Before we begin, I'd like to apologize for my pronunciation of French words that I'll use in this script. I'm sure I'll get something wrong, so I figured I'd just say that now. With that being said, Villaplane was born on December 24th, 1904, in Algiers, which was still a part of French Algeria. In 1921, at the age of 16, Villaplane moved from North Africa to his uncle's farm in Sété. Here, he joined the local football club. Although only 16 years old, FC Sété's manager, Victor Gibson, recognized considerable potential in the young Alexander. Gibson fast-tracked Villaplane into the club's first team, where he played for 3 years from 1921 to 1924, before financial concerns restricted his involvement in football. In 1924, professionalism was still explicitly forbidden in French football. This means that clubs were not allowed to pay salaries to players no matter what. Villaplane was, therefore, not drawing any form of income from his time at FC Sété. Eventually, he was unable or unwilling, though likely some combination of both, to continue playing for a club which did not pay for his services, and so in 1924 he ceased to play for FC Sété. He did not retire from football altogether, though, earning his first appearance as captain of the French national football team in a 1926 match against Belgium. In 1927, Villaplane returned to league football when he found a club willing to pay him. Professionalism was still forbidden, but clubs were able to circumvent this ban by offering players jobs as assistants or clerks. Officially, this means that the club was not directly paying player salaries, while nonetheless being able to offer financial incentive to attract players. FC Sété was unwilling to offer Villaplane such a job, but the club's local rivals, Nîmes Olympique, were more than willing to financially compensate him, and so he joined the club in 1927. It was here in Nîmes that Villaplane was propelled into true football stardom. Fans loved his aggressive, high-energy play style and unparalleled ability to head the ball. His selection as captain of the 1928 French Olympic team only propelled him to greater heights of stardom. Eventually, Villaplane drew the attention of Racing Club de Paris. RC Paris had just appointed a new president whose goal was to win a championship, something which would be considerably easier with an Olympic midfielder on the roster. In 1929, RC Paris made an offer for Villaplane's services. Professionalism was still 3 years away from being allowed, and therefore the details of Villaplane's salary were not recorded, but it was evidently substantial enough to entice the Olympian from southern France to the capital city of Paris. Despite the bans on player salaries, Villaplane made no effort to hide the fact that he was earning substantial amounts of money. He was known for lavish parties, exorbitant bar tabs, and most importantly, gambling. While playing with RC Paris, Villaplane became a well-known regular of the local horse racing track, which is significant because while gambling at the racetrack, Villaplane was also mingling with members of the French criminal underworld. Villaplane played with RC Paris for 3 years, from 1929 to 1932. During this time, he also made several more appearances for the French national team. Most significantly, He was chosen as captain of the 1930 team that would represent France in the inaugural World Cup, something which Villaplane himself considered his proudest achievement. In 1932, the French Football Federation legalized professionalism within the sport. The administration at FC Antibes saw the new era of professionalism as a major opportunity to establish the club, and signed Villaplane on his first official football contract. For its inaugural season, Ligue 1 was divided into two groups, with the championship to be decided in a game between the first-ranked team in each division. Led by Villaplane, FC Antibes successfully won the first position in Group B. However, just as the club prepared to challenge Olympique Lillois in the first professional championship in French football history, FC Antibes was accused of bribery and match-fixing, which disqualified them from playing in the final match. Officially, the team's manager was accused of this and banned from participating in any way with the French Football Federation. However, it was widely believed among the club's supporters and commentators that Villaplane, alongside two of his former Cité teammates, were responsible for the scandal. It was never officially proven that Villaplane engaged in match-fixing, but both he and his former Cité teammates were fired from Antibes during the off-season, lending a degree of credibility to these accusations, especially since it would not be the last gambling scandal Villaplane would be embroiled in. After being sacked from Antibes, OGC Nice quickly hired Villaplane for the 1934-35 season. They would almost immediately regret this. Villaplane was a far cry from the Olympic midfielder that football fans had come to know and love. He was frequently fined for missing practice, often lacked fitness, and seemed completely uninterested in football. He was also completely consumed by his gambling addiction, to the point that he preferred to spend his time and money at the racetrack as opposed to almost anything else. After an uninspiring season, Nice released Villaplane as a free agent. By this point, only one club was willing to take a chance on the now 30-year-old midfielder. Victor Gibson, Villaplane's old manager at FC Cité, was now the manager of the second division club Hispano-Bastidien. He convinced the administration of the club to take a chance and offer Villaplane a contract. However, after only 3 months, Gibson fired Villaplane for frequently failing to attend practice. He would end the 1934-35 season in prison, after being arrested for fixing horse races. This would mark the definitive end of Villaplane's football career. If you're still here, I apologize for making you listen to 2 pages worth of scripted material entirely about association football a century ago. I am well aware that people do not watch my channel for sports facts. However, I think it's important to note that Villaplane was an athletic superstar and a full-blown celebrity before he was a Nazi collaborator. It also highlights that Villaplane was a man driven to avarice. His high-stakes gambling, flagrant disregard for player salary rules, and involvement in match-fixing all illustrate that Villaplane had expensive taste, and that he was willing to do whatever he had to, legal or otherwise, to finance that taste. Villaplane's football career also shows that he was a competent leader, capable of handling high-stress situations like captaining a national team, something which would translate well into his later military service. After 1935, Villaplane's activity is difficult to account for. He had been accustomed to the lifestyle of a football superstar, spending money with reckless abandon and earning a reputation as a wealthy libertine with a penchant for high-stakes gambling. However, without a top-league professional salary to pay for these pursuits, Villaplane was unable to continue his drinking, gambling, and carousing. From 1935 to 1940, Villaplane is difficult to account for, though it is known that he sustained himself as a petty criminal and gambling racketeer, having been arrested numerous times for match-fixing and fraud over the next 5 years. On September 3, 1939, France declared war on Nazi Germany, a response to the German invasion of Poland. In June of 1940, continental France fell under German occupation. For most of France, this brought with it despair and fear, but for Villaplane, it was an opportunity. Villaplane was still in contact with many of his former teammates, many of whom were nationals of other countries. In addition to these football contacts, he was also in contact with numerous French criminals. Combining these connections, Villaplane began to work as a smuggler. He would primarily smuggle goods out of France for anyone willing to pay for his services, specializing in getting gold, jewelry, and other valuables out of the country for anyone who sought to hide their wealth from seizure by the German military. Villaplane also began to racketeer the Parisian Jewish population, extorting money from Jewish families. Later, when Jewish deportations began in 1941, Villaplane would turn in Jewish people to the Nazi administration in return for a bounty. Villaplane's first interaction with the German occupation force came in 1940, when he was arrested for possession of stolen goods, for which he received 2 months in prison. Villaplane's involvement as a smuggler continued to land him in legal trouble until 1942, when he was forced to flee from Paris entirely, seeking refuge in Toulouse in an effort to evade German military law. However, after receiving a set of false documents from Louis Cazal, a former teammate from FC Cité, he returned to Paris that same year. However, he did not retire from his criminal lifestyle, and in 1943, Villaplane would again be arrested for his involvement in a jewelry heist. For this, he was imprisoned at the Royal Campagne internment camp. Unbeknownst to Villaplane, his criminal career had not only earned him a prison sentence, he had also captured the attention of Henry Lafont. Before the war, Lafont had been a leading figure in Parisian organized crime, notable for his ruthless tactics and sadistic tendencies. After the German invasion, however, Lafont offered his services as a counter-resistance agent. Despite concerns among the German military about recruiting and relying on criminals, Lafont's efficacy at fighting resistance forces quickly overruled any concerns his commanders may have felt. By 1943, Lafont had earned himself a position as the commander of Active Group Hesse, known colloquially as the Carlinge or the French Gestapo. Active Group Hesse was a covert paramilitary composed of former criminals recruited mostly from prisons, whose role was to track down anyone the Nazi government considered an enemy of the state. This predominantly meant members of the French resistance, though it also included the Jewish and Romani population. In return, members of Active Group Hesse were allowed to plunder whatever valuables they could find from their targets, an arrangement that allowed criminals like Lafont and those he recruited to make a considerable amount of money hunting anyone the Nazi government would consider an enemy. It is unknown what drew Lafont's attention to Villaplane. Perhaps it was his profile as a former football star, maybe it was his experience with smugglers, or maybe it was just a random selection. Whatever the reason, Lafont recruited Villaplane shortly after his imprisonment, arranging for his release from internment. Although Villaplane was initially recruited as a chauffeur, whose only role in the organization was to drive the leadership of the Carlinge around, his affinity for profiteering and experience leading men in high-stress situations quickly proved him to be a more valuable asset to the group. Villaplane was made a field agent for Active Group Hesse, equivalent in duty to a non-commissioned officer. While in this new role, Villaplane also apparently developed an incredibly sadistic streak. Mass executions under Villaplane's command were commonplace. Active Group Hesse kept no records. Indeed, it is very likely that Henry Lafont was entirely illiterate and had no way of keeping records, so there is absolutely no way of telling exactly how many people were executed by Villaplane and the men under his command. However, that number was at least in the hundreds. Eyewitness testimony confirms that he would routinely execute suspected resistance members and their associates by the dozen, some as young as 17 years of age. When he wasn't ordering mass executions, Villaplane seemed to take joy in torture, both physical and psychological. An incident in 1944 saw Villaplane order his men to execute 2 peasants who had been accused of sheltering a Jewish man. Villaplane apparently watched, laughing, as his soldiers burned these men to death before shooting their bodies numerous times with machine guns in view of their neighbors and family. Such events were evidently common under Villaplane's command as well. Villaplane was not only sadistic, he was efficient and ruthless, pursuing his military career with the same determination and drive he had dedicated to football earlier in his life. In March 1944, Villaplane's sadistic cruelty and ruthless efficiency in hunting resistance members earned him a formal promotion to the rank of SS Untersturmführer, equivalent in rank to a lieutenant, in the newly created North African Brigade. The North African Brigade was a unit created from African-born white Frenchmen, like Villaplane, that would work to combat the French resistance, similar to active Group Hesse. Villaplane's experience, alongside the fact that the North African Brigade had been Henry Lafont's idea, earned him a promotion within the newly created force. In March, his unit was assigned to combat resistance forces in Périgueux, before being reassigned to Aimé the following month. Villaplane did not stop his reign of terror, although by March of 1944 he could feel that the winds were shifting against Germany and decided to hedge his bets by attempting to earn himself sympathy. He made grand gestures of releasing French resistance members or allowing them to escape, all while lamenting loudly and publicly that he had been forced into collaboration. Of course, Villaplane's targets were only spared if they could afford to pay him a usually hefty sum, once offering to spare a man in exchange for 400,000 francs. Those who could not afford to bribe Villaplane were subject to the same savagery he had displayed with the Carlingia. Villaplane's efforts to court sympathy with the French public did not work. After the Allied invasion of France commenced on June 6, 1944, partisan activity increased dramatically. Villaplane, Lafont, and their associates responded to this with severe reprisals. On June 11, 1944, Villaplane's men executed 52 people and arrested a further 350 in Moussadoum, a reprisal for a raid by French partisans earlier in the day. Despite the brutal crackdowns by the North African Brigade and the Carlingia, partisan activity continued to grow as Allied forces advanced further into France. In August, Paris was liberated from Nazi control. That same month, Villaplane would be captured by resistance fighters and sent back to Paris for trial. This is unusual. Most Nazi collaborators were executed immediately upon capture, most commonly in spontaneous acts of vigilantism. However, it was decided that Villaplane, alongside the rest of the Carlingia's leadership, should be publicly tried for their atrocities instead. Villaplane was sent back to Paris for the final time, to be held on trial for his wartime activities. This was little more than a show trial. Villaplane's atrocities had been witnessed by hundreds of people, and there was little doubt as to his guilt. His name was among the most feared Nazi collaborators in France, with a well-documented reputation for savage violence and wanton destruction. His trial was little more than a formality, and on December 24, 1944, Alexandre Villaplane was executed by firing squad at the age of 40 years old. Alexandre Villaplane is indisputably one of the worst people in sporting history. Most athletes can only dream of achieving what Villaplane did on the pitch, and yet these achievements have been rendered meaningless by his legacy of cruelty, violence, and terror. Even today, even for an organization as corrupt and ethically bankrupt as FIFA, Alexandre Villaplane is almost certainly the worst man the sport has ever seen, and hopefully the worst it will ever see. I've been the Lunar Librarian. If you're still here, thank you for watching, and until next time, goodbye.